Dipsy is here. We'll look at the international papers around the world, of course. A lot of reactions, of course, Dipsy, to the ongoing unrest in Iran.
That's right. Much like in the French papers, there's a lot of focus on this unrest in the Iranian papers as well as the papers abroad. This after the country's most violent night since the unrest started last week. Let's start with the Tehran Times, which is headlined on Rouhani's New Year's Day speech, in which he essentially downplayed the protests, calling them, quote, an opportunity, not a threat, while another Iranian paper, Shag Daily, that's been pretty critical of past governments and has even been shut down on several occasions in the past. Well, they've published this scathing opinion piece by an Iranian intellectual who basically explains that protesters' grievances are not just about economy, but what they see as widespread corruption at government levels. The paper says, I quote, "It's time for the authorities to think of the solution and provide opportunities for the nation." And there's also a pretty damning cartoon from the British daily, The Times. Terror, repression, and corruption, all of this buried underneath the turban of Iran's supreme leader.
You found actually some quite mixed reactions, haven't you, in the papers, then to how the West should actually respond to this as well?
Well, there's a bit of a discord, I guess, about what the approach should be. You have the Washington Post. Really, the question is, should they respond or not? And if they do, how do they respond? Let's start with the Washington Post, which in its editorial today says Western leaders should speak up. They should intervene. They should support the protesters, at least by helping protesters communicate with each other after the regime restricted the internet. The paper also advocates for more sanctions against Iran, especially if the bloodshed continues. On the other hand, you have Haaretz, which is an Israeli paper, that says journalists, pundits, and politicians need to exercise humility when addressing the crisis. Otherwise, I quote, "any outside intervention will serve the regime in its claims that the protests are somehow orchestrated by the West."
Let's go back to that story we were talking to Iris Makler about, the Palestinian teenager in Israel being indicted after she was filmed, slapped and kicked two Israeli soldiers in the West Bank.
Well, Ahed Hamini is just 16 years old, but she's become, of course, this prominent Palestinian activist, a young, familiar figure of the Palestinian resistance. That's what Le Monde says in this article, noting that she's actually part of a young Israeli generation, of Palestinians, rather, who've only ever known Israeli occupation. And her courage has even been hailed by the international community. She was, of course, arrested last month for kicking and slapping two Israeli soldiers outside her home in a video that went viral. This occurred shortly after Israeli police shot a cousin of hers in the face with a rubber bullet. Hamini's father has actually penned an article in Haaretz, the Israeli paper, essentially calling her a freedom fighter. He says he's proud of his daughter for standing up to the police, adding that freedom isn't given as a charity, and despite the heavy price, they're ready to pay it.
Hopefully you had a good New Year. We're all back to normal here on France 24 with our full programmes today. Hopefully you enjoyed your New Year. But the New Year also brought some good news for endangered species of elephants. China officially banned the ivory trade, didn't it?
This is a pretty big move from China because China is the world's largest ivory industry. The Chinese State Forestry Department has called it a New Year's gift to elephants, according to the China Daily. What once was the world's biggest ivory center has now shut down all of its legal processing and trading companies. This remains to be seen what happens to the illegal ivory trade, because that obviously is still flourishing. It's believed that 30,000 elephants are killed annually for the ivory trade. So this is definitely good news for animal rights activists and, of course, the elephants. Here you see them in a China Daily cartoon fighting off poachers with that armor of protection, that ban on the ivory trade. Now, according to the China Daily, 1 in 5 people has said they'll continue to buy ivory despite the ban. One activist has told the paper that the only way to root out the ivory trade is to remove the, quote, sick pursuit of ivory from people's hearts.
Yeah, very happy New Year to the elephants. We've wished you a happy New Year as well. And now Dipsy's going to scare you to death. This is a fine for some kids at a school in Australia.
That's right. Happy New Year.
Exactly.
This actually took place just before the holidays. But basically, if you're an ophidophobe, I had to look that up. up. That's having an irrational fear of snakes. Ophidiophobia.
Okay.
That's probably the word that would represent most of us looking at this article. This story will not do much in taming that fear. The Sydney Morning Herald reports that students at a school in Australia discovered several white eggs laid in their school's sandpit. They turned out to be snake eggs, and not just any old snake, brown snake eggs, which is one of the most deadliest snakes in Australia.
Right.
When they called wildlife experts, after 3 days of digging, authorities removed 7 nests and 43 eggs in total.
Oh, my goodness. Okay.
The snakelings were just 2 weeks away from hatching. So imagine the pandemonium that would have taken place if they had all hatched in that sand pit.
Yeah.
It's believed that the pit was freshly laid with sand, which made it really, really comfortable for the mama snake. 1 or 2, we're not sure how many of them laid their eggs. Anyway, the sand was really great for laying eggs. Definitely not one for the faint-hearted.
No, it's probably almost time for the kids to start going back to school in Australia as
That's
well.
right.
So it would have provided a bit more bit of pandemic. Another month?
Another month. They're on their summer school holidays.
Yeah, I know they're on summer holidays, but another month? All right. Thank you very much, Tipsy. Tipsy with the papers and steam of business here on France 24.